Hello and welcome back to the Creative Dimension Trust Online Workshop. I'm Rene Gonzalez, your painting tutor for today. Today, I'm going to be painting the self-portrait we saw last week. So I hope you all enjoy painting and have your painting materials ready. I'd like to share a couple of examples of artists who use the self-portrait as their subject in their paintings to promote their themes of feminism, modernism, and personal struggles.
So I just thought these were great examples of identity and the role it plays in different artists' works. This is Tamara de Lempica. She was a successful painter of the Art Deco movement, a glamorous design style of the 1920s. She painted with her refined artistic skill and was noticeable for her assertive, feminine confidence, refusing to live by sexist feminine stereotypes. She portrayed strong, powerful women, and she was one of the early female artists addressing and subverting the male gaze. One of her most famous works is the self-portrait Tamara in the Green Bugatti, where we see her in the driving seat of a powerful and luxurious car. It's unclear whether she considered herself overtly feminist, but her contribution to feminism is clear. She was a highly successful female artist in a traditionally male-dominated world, and she depicted strong, sexually confident women in her paintings. This is Frida Kahlo's self-portrait with cropped hair, an artwork that Frida painted after divorcing her husband, a famous mural painter called Diego Rivera. He loved her colorful dresses and her long hair, which is why she's represented herself in a dark muted suit with her hair cut short. Her paintings were a reflection of her own life and of herself. When asked if her art was Mexican folk art or surrealism, she simply said, "I paint my own reality." So I thought these were good examples to talk about the concept of the artist's identity. We see that they use similar themes of challenging stereotypes of women in their time, and they both use as their subject a self-portrait of themselves. Both are incredibly powerful and perhaps equally successful, but the way each of the paintings explores the personal identity of the artists that created them makes them incredibly unique. And though the self-portrait is an evident example to talk about the artist's identity, it actually goes further than that. And I would imagine that every artwork says something about the identity of the artist that created it. Here's a different example of how interesting and important the idea of the artistic identity is in the art world. In an interview, David Hockney talks about how looking at a stuffed owl inside a case is not that interesting, and why one of Picasso's paintings of an owl is so marvelous. And he says that it's because this is not an owl. The artwork is not about the owl. It's a human being looking at an owl. It's the account of a person looking at an object, and that's what thrills us. And there's more owlness there than in the stuffed owl. He also talks about how cameras can't catch certain subtleties, but the painter can exaggerate them slightly in order to prioritize or emphasize certain aspects of things and objects. So this is great advice to move into today's exercise. For our subject today, the idea was to do a self-portrait, or if you prefer, the portrait of someone else. And we should all have our drawings that we will now start painting. As I showed you in the previous lesson, this is my illustration for my self-portrait. For the theme, you can choose anything you want. I chose the summer, or something like spending time outdoors, as I've been loving being able to be at the park or a wooded area. This is the image that I used as source material for my illustration, and we'll be going back to it as we go through our painting. I'm visualizing a green summer outdoors, so I know that will eventually be the environment around my character. So I'm going to be trying to use other colors that will go well with the green, and that may still also represent summer, so that they are consistent with my theme. I'll have to consider what works as good contrast or what harmonizes with a green background. So let's start our painting. I want to begin by getting rid of the white paper, so I think I'll do that by glazing my illustration with a ground pigment. Because I like to play with different textures, I've decided to prime the area with the t-shirt with some white paint or primer before I go over the surface with my ground, just so that I have some variety in my composition. First, I apply an even layer of slightly watered down paint, and then, once it's dried, I look at the photo I'm using as reference to go over a second layer, painting just some highlights on top of my first layer of white primer. Doing white on white may seem weird, but hopefully those details will come through after I've gone over it with several layers. Once it dries, I wet my paper a little so that when I apply my ground, the marks aren't too rigid or definitive. I loosely cover the surface with my ground pigment and then wipe out the excesses. I chose cadmium yellow because it's a warm color and it goes with the theme of summer I chose for this exercise. We also associate it with the sun, so it's definitely appropriate. Now the ground has been laid down, the next thing I'll start working on is the chair, which is mostly brown in the image I'm working from. I've started with an ochre yellow this time. By the way, I have had to speed up the majority of this video quite a bit because it took some time to work on this painting. So brown is basically a dark yellow, and I figured it makes sense to move from the yellow background to the brown chair. And just like we did with the transcription exercise, I start with a thinner, watered down layer, and I'll progressively move towards thicker, drier pigments. And let's be clear that I am not trying to recreate things in a realistic technique. It's more like I look at the image I'm copying and get inspiration from the visual information I read on the photo. And then I start to translate that information into my painting, but with little concern on whether it looks like the original picture or not. It's just a guide, and what I really find appealing is how the painting reveals a process of focus, observation, and information processing, as well as the skill of manipulating pigment, texture, and color. Not because it's realistic. We are simply attempting some methods of representation through visual language. Actually, some of the errors, inaccuracies, and imperfections become some of the most interesting aspects as they reveal human imperfection and even perhaps personal aspects of the artist's thought process and identity. I start with the most obvious information, like the clear lines created by light and shadows, and as my chair becomes more defined, I move into more refined details like more subtle contrasts or more difficult curves and textures. When looking at the source image, I can observe hues of brown and maroon and hints of like a sienna kind of yellow. So if you notice my palette, it's like I broke down those pigments and deconstructed them a bit. And then by playing around with the colors laid down, I expand my palette by mixing my paints and creating new colors with more grays and pastel tones. So I've basically curated and customized my palette a little bit. Sometimes, if I get the smallest hint of a color, shade, or highlight, I'll then use it as an excuse to add more different colors, like saturated colors or brighter highlights, to fit my painting according to my personal aesthetic preferences, just however I find convenient. Like maybe in the original picture, the chair had a tiny bit of pink that reflected the color of the room around it. So I used that and let my imagination push the pink into different areas. Doing this can guide me through certain passages in my painting, and these moments become like another driving force that contradicts the intention of just accurately copying the source material. This allows for a unique product that is the result of your own kind of visual and aesthetic expression. So, moving on to my character now, I'm going to just paint some shadows with darker pigments of yellow. I continue with my ochre yellow for this, which will work very well and keep my palette consistent. As I'm applying the pigment, you can probably tell I'm trying to think about and map the shape of the face, which is that hesitation we see as my eyes go back and forth from the picture to my painting, while I think about trying to direct my brush strokes as if sculpting the volume of the character. It's just a general transparent glaze in darker areas where we see some shade in the picture, but it helps to give things just some depth and volume. If, when you're painting, you think about the shape of the surface you're trying to represent. The very light yellow ground also serves as the effect of the light when it hits the face of the character. So I'm creating highlights by just avoiding those areas. I find I like to try to be subtle when it comes to faces, as I've said before, because it's easy to make expressions too harsh or exaggerated, so I try to be careful here. This is simply my personal preference, and each artist develops different sensitivities and style. So I imagine the space around my character will be an outdoor setting with a lot of green, probably the color we identify the most with summer. So this is important to keep in mind for the decisions I take when I paint my subject. I'm trying to stay with my warmer tones, appropriate for the theme of the warmest season. So red seems to me like a good option for the clothes. It contrasts with the green and harmonizes with yellow. I mix some crimson red with some black, white, and a couple of tones of gray on my palette, and I get some new colors I feel are quite appealing, like muddier reds and pinks. Once more anticipating a watery glaze, I've primed small details from the trainers with some white primer, and move on to something else while that dries. I apply these first watered down layers that will serve as ground pigments for the clothing, first using pink for the shirt and jacket area, and because I primed the shirt earlier, the surfaces react differently to the pigment. I try to create some textures through the movement of my brushstrokes as well, playing around with the paint a bit. And again, so that it's not a flat block of color, I apply pigments directly in some areas and afterwards spread it with a watered down brush so there's some irregularity and more dynamic marks when I apply the paint. I apply another layer of primer on the trainers and leave it to dry once more. When I move on to the red for the trousers and shoes, we see I first apply the paint on the areas where the shadows would be, and then just spread it with water. By doing it this way, I'm creating a light and shade structure as I apply my ground pigment. Acrylics really lend themselves to manipulating saturation and texture by playing with the levels of water you use to dilute the paint, and it can really create great effects and many different results. As the paint I'm laying down dries, we see some of the marks remain under the later, lighter, more watered down layers. And that's another factor we can take into account as we build up and construct our paintings. We can also see that when I glaze the shoes, the primed areas are still distinguishable from the rest of the unprimed surface. So that's about it for this stage, and we've created a layer of ground pigment for most of our character that we're now going to be able to build on top of. So now I've applied some ground color pigment for my character, I'm going to move in with the darker hues. So I'm trying to find the absolute darkest areas in the photo, and I'm going to start adding them to my composition. Obviously, the first thing that stood out to me was the hair. And again, I try to shape and simulate the different volumes and behaviors that hair has, trying to follow the different movements and direction it goes in with my paintbrush, instead of applying like an even flat coat of paint throughout the area. I chose Payne's Gray for this in place of a black for the shade of the dark hair. This is just a very dark blue. I really like this hue, and I just thought it made sense to create shades with blue, which is a cold color, to counteract with the yellow, pink, and red, which are warmer colors. As I move into the facial features, you may notice how much more restrained and subtle the brush strokes become, as I lay down the pigment delicately on the paper without applying too much pressure, as the facial features have a lot of subtle information packed in a small amount of space. And I either lightly tap the surface with my brush using very little amount of pigment, or I dilute the paint with water so that when I drag the brush through the smaller sections, the textures are subtle enough not to make a mark that could be too intense. There are some moments when I feel like maybe I've gone too far. So what I do is I just make some lighter pigments to counteract the shade in just certain areas. Sometimes you can hardly notice the brush has any paint at all, as I create the tiniest nuances of shade in some areas. I slowly start moving the shade into the rest of the character, starting with the jacket, and again, I think you can easily notice my thought pattern as I lay down some pigment, then I stop as I am looking at the source image, and I then go back to laying down the information I'm trying to process. So, this is just to say that constructing my self portrait requires a lot of concentration, and you may often find yourself hesitating and struggling as you go through the motions of painting. Another thing that starts happening here is how, following from the shading process, I start using my dark paint to introduce a descriptive outline on the character. This is in no way realistic, as things in nature don't really have an outline describing their shape, but I like it and use it nonetheless because it's an easy way to render visual information. I'm illustrating and trying to create transitions by diluting the pigment with water as well. So it becomes a very playful back and forth, and I try to describe the jacket using two or three methods at the same time, fluidly switching from one to the other here and there. And I'm basically going to do this for the whole of the jacket surface with this illustrative line, as it's an easy way to solve how to represent the different folds, pockets, buttons, and the collar that isn't too time consuming. By comparison, this is rather different to how I represented the chair, which was more about using overlapping layers of color to represent the object's surface, using painterly gestures to drag pigment and shape it into the highlights and shadows. This now is just a much more graphic style of representing objects, with a flat, narrow line. And as you may notice, it's very similar to drawing with ink, because the paint is watered down to make fluid lines on the painting paper. So these are different styles you can use when depicting figures and objects. I often fluctuate between the graphic and the painterly in my own works. And since I didn't leave any of the lighter yellow ground on the hands, I quickly paint some highlights on, just so the shape doesn't get lost. I don't know about you, but when I look at the dark blue pigment, I feel it really works, and it's like I can notice a cooler temperature in the shaded blue pigmentation, almost like a cold breeze is hitting the areas with the colder color. I create a quick shade and highlight contrast on the socks as well by painting a stripe of shade and smearing the pigment with water so it fades from darker to lighter tones. I even use my hands to wipe the excesses and edit a bit while the paint is still wet. And I also go back in with the lighter pink where I need to redo a bit of the highlights. And it's important to keep going back to the image I'm copying to use as reference and see where shadows are more or less dark. So it doesn't seem like I'm just coloring in a generic or half hearted way. And so we see here that I'm also going back into the hands with my dark line because hands have different volumes and shapes that can be really hard to represent. So I'm just using the dark line for this as it's probably an easier way to do so. At this point, we can notice how I'm constantly moving from one area to the other, mixing it up, and just slowly building up as I figure out how best to complete the different areas on my paper. And as I work on one aspect, it informs me on what needs to be worked on next. Like when I was doing the graphic line, I then decided to go more painterly for the trousers, which then makes me add some lines again on the hands and so on. So find your own balance and try different things to make your art dynamic and playful. These decisions on how you choose to construct aesthetic values in your paintings are some of the things that will define your unique style as an artist, and part of what's interesting about each individual artist's practice. As I'm going through this back and forth, we see that I eventually decide to go back into the highlights of the pink shirt as well. And this is most of my self-portrait done here. It's a loose and simple painting, not too technical, and it may just be missing a few expressive moments and details we'll be going into soon. I glazed the whole of the trousers and trainers with some watered down red, and I'm just redefining the shoes a bit with my dark line in order to make them a little more detailed. Once I move to the trousers and shoes, I also try to go back to the more painterly technique for a little, where I play more with the blocks of paint instead of just the line. And I give them a quick layer of tonal shade, and I'll then leave it to dry before applying more layers on it. So now, for the final stages of my self-portrait, I begin to define the edges by using white paint to go around my character and the chair. Working on the negative space, before moving into the background I'll eventually paint for the composition, is just a way to avoid using a line to define the perimeter of your figures and objects, and it can also be used to clean up and straighten your lines a bit if you want. We see it's especially useful for the little corners and crevices, as it can really help shape the negative spaces, and in turn, the objects and figures are shaped as well. So, I eventually just start working on the areas that require a bit more attention to detail or decorative qualities, like the lines on the socks, which are an aesthetic designy element in the clothing. Personally, I just love lines and I try to include as many as I can, like in different items of clothing or fabric or, background wallpapers. But in this case, mostly because of time restraint, I just used it here on this small item of clothing, which is the socks. But feel free to decorate and have more designy elements in your works. After painting the lines on, I go back in with some pink for some highlights. I leave the top edge of pigment and start diluting right below so that it gradually fades in a gradient from light to dark. I will then also fade the shadows on the socks just the same way into the volume of the lines. This is a little bit like the fading effect that we saw in the first lesson, where we're trying to make like a middle that is gray between the light and the dark. Okay, and lastly, I only need to work on the red pants that need more definition and provide a great area of canvas where I can make some more expressive and painterly marks. So I'm going to exaggerate the information I read on the picture as much as I can and push the boundaries of copying, interpretation, and imagination a bit more here. When I was shading the red and pink areas throughout my self-portrait with the dark blue, it resulted in some shades of purple. So I just leaned on this and just made a full-on pastely gray purple to include it in my palette to use for my shades and highlights that will go on top of the red trousers. This will be the most color explosive moment in my painting. As now that most of the constructing and shaping have been built up, I feel I can afford to be more creative and experimental. This is a strong way to start with these shading and highlights for the trousers, and I just make some intuitive and rather bolder mark making for this last stretch of my painting, as I try to infuse some energy and noise to try and balance out how muted and subtle a lot of the process has been. It's a bit more expressive. I'm smudging different pigments into each other and using thick paint to make stronger textures, effectively creating pasty volumes of acrylic on my paper. But these bursts of expression are still grounded to some degree on the picture, as I'm looking at it and trying to find information to inspire my brush strokes and decisions with colors and shapes. I'm slightly less delicate and controlled here, which also means I'll make more mistakes, but it's worth the more inspired results, I think. It's perhaps not a perfect self portrait, but it's a very exciting and interesting exercise, and I'm very happy with the result. Like I've stated before, this is just my personal process, and every artist has to go about finding their style and process by making their own decisions when they paint and face different challenges. So this is it. This is the end of my self-portrait. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy the end result as much as I do. I think it was just really fun, and I really look forward to seeing how you approach your own self-portrait.